good fleet planning process is really an exercise in understanding the options available across the entire spectrum of private aviation resources, whether it's charter, membership, fractional ownership, whole aircraft ownership, or a blend of all of the above. A good fleet planning process is really there to determine what is the right application, getting the right metal for the right mission.
A fleet plan should be conducted at least annually. Taking a look at where your organization is currently and where it's headed is always an evolution. So making sure that you're revisiting your fleet plan. It doesn't have to be a formal process every year, but at least revisiting the process. You know, doing a formal process, what, every 5 years?
Yeah, and I think it hinges largely on what strategic changes are happening with an organization. So it's a little bit different for large companies, mid-cap companies versus high net worth individuals. Oftentimes we'll see a need sort of for an out-of-cycle fleet plan when we see a merger or acquisition with a large public company, when we see a change in leadership at the top level with any company, when we see a new house bought or a new grandchild born with a high net worth individual. So there are a number of different dynamics that may necessitate a revisitation to a fleet plan. Fleet planning can vary pretty dramatically whether you're a Fortune 100, 200 type company, a mid-cap type company, or a high net worth individual. Some of the dynamics that may come into play there are frequency of aircraft replacement cycle, supplemental lift needs, getting multiple people, multiple groups of people to various destinations at one time, amongst many other things.
The participation in a fleet planning process should be a cross-functional team. Thinking out loud, Colby, we've got the finance groups, we've got really the C-suite or the executives who can drive the strategy of where we're headed. The operational team that has seen the operation day to day, that can really have the first view sight of what's happening with the organization and how the travelers travel.
Yeah, every organization is different, but something that gives us the composition of a team that can speak to the operational need, the financial goals, and then the cultural requirements. I think those three components are what we're really trying to accomplish by assembling a good team. A good fleet planning process is going to be a combination of your historical utilization evaluated in addition to any intended changes or expected changes in the go-forward utilization. We want to look at that in both a utilization metric perspective as well as understanding the financial impact of what you've been doing and how does that compare to the options that you're considering going forward.
The historic data also provides some really important insights such as frequent destinations, passenger loads, other elements that provide some baseline understanding of how the operation is done historically. The strategic input going forward through stakeholder interviews will give some insight as to what the future is going to require. How far are we going to go further? What's going to be different about what we know about historic performance?
I think stakeholder interviews, giving the rest of the story, can also streamline the process to a degree. We see it oftentimes in large organizations where middle managers may not have the horsepower to be able to make command decisions, and so those stakeholder interviews really help streamline the options, understanding clearly what the mandates and prohibitions are. For the first-time user, the process changes a little bit. We don't have the historical footprint to base off, so it's really predicated on expectations. The critical element to that is not pigeonholing yourself into one solution based on branding, but really understanding the details of the entire landscape of options available to you. As a first-time user, evaluating the whole landscape of options becomes important because there's some pretty significant differences. The range of options in general terms includes charter and membership programs, fractional ownership, and whole aircraft ownership. Each of those solutions has fairly significant pros and cons as well as barriers to entry and exit. So understanding those details is a critical component for the first-time buyer. One of the key components in a fleet plan is what's called the 90% rule. No solution is going to accommodate everything you want to do in a perfect fashion. So the goal that we set is if we can find the right solution to accommodate 90% of the need, the other 10% can be solved after the fleet planning process is complete.
Yeah, I find when we look at the financial modeling, you've got to look at the full lifetime ownership of what you're considering for the aircraft. That could be 3, 5, 10, whatever the organization is looking at from a go-forward basis. But we have to really look at all the elements and components, and that includes fixed variable costs as well as depreciation.
Yeah, it's interesting when we go through the process. a lot of the conversation starts surrounding capital sensitivity, right? What's the front end buy-in number? But that is a very small component of a full story. And that's the critical element in my mind in a good fleet planning process, is really understanding that life cycle cost exposure.
And during that same period, we take a look at, there's a lot of variability over an ownership cycle.
Totally.
Maintenance, there's different things that are going to happen during the course of ownership. Having that built in and having that full picture just gives them a lot more information to make a good decision.
Yeah. You know, one of the interesting components that I see when we're doing financial modeling with large corporate entities is just the difference in how you handle amortization and depreciation of an aviation asset versus other fixed assets they've got on their balance sheet. It's not uncommon to only own an airplane 8 or 10 years in a corporate application, and so that's very different than a building that they own downtown. It takes some rationalization and some conversation, frankly, with the finance group to understand those differences.
Mm-hmm.
One of the critical components that we always talk about in a fleet plan is trying to arrive at what's the right ownership structure, whether that's a cash purchase, externally financed acquisition, leasing, synthetic leasing. There are a variety of options for on-balance sheet treatment of an asset that really come up as part of a good fleet plan. One of the ancillary considerations that always comes up is internally versus externally managed, going to a third-party management company, since in most organizations aviation is not core to the business.
Yeah, and I'll offer one other thought on the financing structure around that is you need to consider around your need for being structurally flexible.
Right.
And that's aligned with your strategy, i.e. a lease is going to be very restrictive to your ability to enter and exit during the course of ownership, whereas financing will give you a lot more flexibility. With any fleet plan, you're going to have a lot of change as you implement your different choices and solutions. So understanding what that cost of change and the time of change is key to consider in the entire spectrum of the solution. These changes don't happen quickly and they're not easily cheap. So understanding really what that whole cost also eliminates some of the surprises that you can occur making these changes.
Yeah, one of the things we see quite often is slow to evaluate, quick to implement, and that's a challenge with any change in solution. So really important aspect. One of the critical components of a good fleet plan is objectivity. We find oftentimes in the marketplace that you'll see offers to have a fleet plan done by a given manufacturer. Maybe it's a service provider that offers fractional or charter membership. I think to have the best outcome, what you need is objectivity in the game. Not someone trying to sell you a product, but someone trying to help solve a problem.
Education in the fleet planning is a huge component of what we do. Yeah, certainly we have the different languages we have to speak throughout. That could be, again, financial, operational, you name it along the way. But the education is a key component of all this, and making sure they have a good, unbiased understanding of what these options really look like is key to the understanding of making a good fleet plan.
Yeah, we say all the time that it is a process rooted in education, and the output is we make recommendations and the client makes the decisions.
Mm-hmm.